Hello and welcome to Deep Learning with PyTorch 0 to GANs. Today we are on lesson 4 Convolutional Neural Networks. My name is Aakash and I am your instructor. By the end of this course, we will figure out how to train a model which can go from producing random noise like this to producing fairly good images of handwritten digits and of anime faces. And what's more interesting is the same model will be used to produce both these kinds of images. All that is going to be different is the data used to train the model. These are called generative adversarial networks or GANs, and we will learn all about them. If you've been following along, you can also earn a certificate of accomplishment for this course by completing the assignments and doing a course project. So we've been discussing these, learning deep learning, and today is the 4th lecture. So let's get started. The first thing to do is to visit 0togans.com, which is the course page, which will bring you to this page here. You can enroll on this page and you can also share this with your friends and invite your friends to join the course. Now you can check out the previous lessons here. Lesson 1 on PyTorch basics and gradient descent. Lesson 2 on working with images and logistic regression, and lesson 3 on training deep neural networks on a GPU. The recordings are available. You can also check out the assignments all about torch.tensor, training your first model, and feed-forward neural networks. So let's open up lesson 4, image classification with convolutional neural networks. You can find a video recording here later. Today the notebook we will be using is called Convolutional Neural Networks. So let's open it up. This is a Jupyter notebook hosted on the Jovian platform. And the topics we are covering today are downloading an image dataset from a web URL, understanding convolution and pooling layers, creating a convolutional neural network from scratch using PyTorch, training a CNN from scratch and monitoring its performance, and underfitting, overfitting, and how to overcome these. Now what you're looking at is a read-only version of the explanations and the code. So if you scroll down here, you can see there is some code as well. To run this code, we need to execute it either using free online resources, or you can execute it on your computer locally. Now, if you're getting started, the right way to do it would be using free online resources. So I'm going to click run here and select run on Colab. And I'm just going to authorize my Google Drive so that the notebook can be placed into Google Drive and executed on Colab. All right, so now we have the same notebook and now we can run the code, we can execute the code. Now, one important thing to keep in mind is that because we are going to be using a fairly large data set and creating a fairly huge machine learning model, it may take a long time if we try to train this on the CPU. And as we learned the last time, we can use a graphics processing unit or GPU to speed up training. Now, Colab comes with a GPU, so we can just click on runtime, click on change runtime type and select GPU from the hardware accelerator, and click save. And now we are ready to start running the code. One last thing, during the lecture or afterwards, if you have any questions, you can ask questions on the course discussion forum, which is linked on the course page. This is on the lesson page. You will find the course discussion forum. You can either create a new topic or just post your question on the topic that is already created here for you. So let's get started then. The one thing I like to do before I start any notebook is to go to edit and select clear all outputs. What this will do is this will remove the outputs of the cells from the previous execution so that we can run all the code ourselves and see the outputs for the first time fresh. So we are going to be using the CFAR10 dataset this time. So let's learn more about it. If you were around for the previous tutorial, you might remember that we trained what is called a feed-forward neural network, and it had 2 layers. It had a hidden layer and then it had some non-linear activation applied to the outputs, and then it had an output layer. And because of this, it was able to capture the non-linear relationships between the inputs, which were handwritten digits, images of handwritten digits from the MNIST dataset, and the outputs, which was a prediction of which digit the image represents with 97% accuracy. Once again, you can go back to the course page and find that previous lesson. So in this lesson, we will use a new dataset called the CFAR10 dataset, CIFAR10, and it consists of 60,000 images. This time they are 32 by 32 pixel images and they are color images in 10 classes. So here are some samples from the dataset. You see here, these are the 10 classes: airplane, automobile, bird, cat, deer, dog, frog, horse, ship, and truck. And you can see some examples from each class. And already you can tell that you can see airplanes are shown in many different angles. Sometimes they're on the land, sometimes they're in the sky, and there are a lot of different backgrounds as well. Like there is some green background here and some gray background here. So there's a lot of variety already, and some of these images, it can be really hard to tell what is in this image. For instance, this could be an airplane or it could be a bird. So that's what makes CIFAR 10 a far more challenging data set. Similarly, we have automobiles of all kinds, and apart from automobiles, we also have trucks. So a lot of trucks can also look like automobiles, and in this case, automobiles are primarily cars. So there is a lot of differentiation, a subtle differentiation that we will have to do between automobile and truck. Then we have bird. We have different species of bird here. We have different species of cat, a deer, dog, frog, horse, ship. So this is a fairly challenging data set, and we'll see how good we can get at classifying images from this data set. Now, if you have attempted assignment 3, then you would have trained a feed-forward neural network on the CIFAR 10 dataset, and no matter how hard you try, it is going to be very hard for you to break the 60 or 65% accuracy barrier for classification. So today we'll see why that is the case and how we can improve it using what is called a convolutional neural network. Now, on Colab, we already have all the required libraries installed, but if you do not have these libraries installed on your system, then you can install the appropriate ones. For instance, on Linux, you will have to, on Linux Binder or Windows, if you do not want to use a GPU, you can uncomment this one. On Linux or Windows, you can, if you want to use a GPU, that is, if you have a GPU on your computer, which is manufactured by NVIDIA, and you have the right CUDA drivers installed, then you can install the version of PyTorch which works with a GPU, and make sure that you uncomment this and you have this exclamation character at the beginning and run this cell. And on Mac OS and on Binder, you will not be able to use a GPU. Then you simply install the CPU version of PyTorch. Now more detailed instructions are given here on how to use a GPU with different platforms. So let's install the required libraries now. Let's import the required libraries. They're already installed on Colab. So we are importing Torch Vision and a few utility functions that we will talk about soon. One other thing we should be doing, and don't forget to do this, every time you run a notebook from Jovian on Colab, you need to run the first cell. What this does is this sets up a connection between this notebook and back to your original notebook on Jovian, so that when you run jovian.commit, we will capture a snapshot and upload it back to your Jovian profile. Alright, so moving right ahead, now let's set a project name that we'll use later. So we are going to this time download the images in PNG format. So far we had used the MNIST dataset, which was already available in Torch Vision, but in a lot of cases in the real world, you will be working with data that is not already part of the library that you are working with. So you will probably need to download it from some online source. Either it could be an internal link within the company, or it could be an external link, something you found online. And there are a lot of great places where you can find a list of interesting datasets to work on. One good place is the FastAI datasets. Now on this page, which is linked from the notebook, will show you, they have a bunch of different image classification datasets here that you can experiment with. And in fact, you can replace the CIFAR 10 dataset with any of these other datasets and just try to see what is different in what you need to do. Okay, most of the code should be exactly the same, and that tells you how powerful deep learning is, that the exact same code can simply be trained on a different dataset and give you very good results. So we are using the CIFAR 10 dataset, and this is the link from the page that we've copied over. So let's set the dataset URL link, and then we are calling the download URL function. The download URL function comes from Torch Vision. You can see here we've imported torchvision.utils datasets.utils download URL. Now the download URL dataset function is going to download this URL and place it in the target folder. Here we are going to download it into the target folder dot, which is basically just the current folder. And there you can see the dataset has been downloaded. And you can see if you open up the folder view, you can see here that you have CIFAR10.tgz. And tgz format represents a tar gzip archive, which is a combination of the tar archive and the gzip archive, or the zip that you must be used to. So we need to first extract this, and to extract it, we can use the tar file module from Python. So we import the tar file module, and then we say with tar file.open, and then we pass the path of the tar file and the format of the tar file. So we want to open it in read mode in a gzip format, and that gives us a tar object. And on the tar object, we can call extract all, and extract all is going to take a path, a target folder, and it is going to download the data into the target folder. So let's do that. This may take a minute because there are 60,000 images that have been compressed. And CIFAR10, even despite this, is actually a small dataset because each image is fairly small. Often you will have images that are much larger, 512 by 512 pixels or even higher. So in that case, downloading and extracting might take even longer. So now you see here, we have a data folder, and then in the data folder, we have a CIFAR10 folder. So this is where our dataset lies. And this is always a good idea to create a folder called data and put all your datasets into the data, especially if you're going to be working with multiple datasets. It's important to separate out your code from your datasets because dataset folders can get pretty large and you may not want to always capture them and put them into a Git repository. You may want to keep them separate. So data/CIFAR10 is our data directory for this dataset. And what we're going to do is, first we're going to look at it here visually, and then we're going to do the same thing using Python. It's always a good idea to just get yourself used to using Python even for file system operations, because that means you do not have to leave the Jupyter notebook, and it also allows you to perform processing on this information. So here you can see we have a folder test and we have a folder train. The same thing we can check by using OS. So the OS module has been imported, and we check os.list_dir and we pass in the data directory. And then similarly, what we can do is if we check the train folder, now inside the train folder, you can see that there are 10 folders, one for each class or one for each category of images that we have. So let's run this. And as you might expect, we get back test and train folders, and then we have all of these category folders as well. Now let's look inside a couple of folders, one from the training set and one from the test set. Now before we do it using code, let's see it visually. So you can see here that you have the airplane folder, and inside the airplane folder, you're going to have a bunch of images of airplanes. Similarly, you have the test folder, and inside the test folder, you have the same 10 classes and a bunch of images for each one. Now visually, we cannot really tell how many images there are in each folder, but now we can do that using Python. So if we call os.dir and then we get the directory path for airplane, then we get the list of airplane files, and we can check the number of training examples for airplanes by simply checking the length of the airplane files list. And there you go, you have 5,000 images of airplanes. So these are the training examples. And let's look at the number of testing examples. So you have 1,000 test examples for ships. And what you can do is you can verify now. You can maybe write a for loop and loop over the classes and verify that each class has 5,000 images, and there are 1,000 images for testing in the test set and 5,000 in the training set. Now this directory structure that we looked at, where we have this folder CIFAR10, and then inside it we have a test and a train folder, and inside the train folder we have one folder for each class. This is a very common directory structure that is used by many different datasets. In fact, if you're creating your own dataset for image classification, the right way to create that dataset, let's say you wanted to classify hot dogs versus pizza. So you would probably go to Google Images and search for hot dog and download 100 images of hot dogs, put them into a folder called hot dog, and then you do another search for pizza and then download 100 images of pizza and put them into a folder called pizza, and then put those two folders, hot dog and pizza, side by side and put them into another folder called train. So that is for your training. That is a very common structure that people use, and that is why deep learning libraries provide utilities for working with such datasets. So we can use the image folder class from Torch Vision to load the data as PyTorch tensors. So we go to Torch Vision. From torchvision.datasets, we're importing image folder, and image folder simply requires the path to the directory. Now, if you want to create the training dataset, we pass the path to the training directory, and inside this directory we have folders for each class. And if you want to pass, you also can pass a transform, because what we want is we want to load these images as PyTorch tensors, and that is where the two tensor transform comes useful. The images are read using the Python imaging library or PIL, and then they're converted using the two tensor transform into PyTorch tensors. So let's run it now, and you can verify once again that this dataset has 50,000 elements. All right, so we have downloaded some data and now we have loaded it up using PyTorch. Now let's look at some sample elements from the training dataset. And as we know, each element is a tuple containing an image tensor and a label. Now, since the data consists of 32 by 32 pixel color images with 3 channels RGB, which stands for red, green and blue, each image tensor will have the shape 3 by 32. And you can see that here you have 3 by 32, and this is what one image tensor looks like. Now each image tensor also has a label. What does the label represent? We know that our classes are actually folder names, and those folder names are textual. So what exactly does this label represent? So you can check dataset.classes. If you check dataset.classes, that will give you the list of all the classes that have been detected automatically by the image folder class, by the image folder object. And the label simply represents that for this particular image tensor, the image that this tensor represents belongs to the folder whose index in dataset.classes is 0. So it belongs to the folder airplane. That means it belongs to the category of airplanes. And this is important because we know that for all the things that we do, cross entropy, accuracy, etc., we are dealing with numbers. We cannot deal with text. So image folder automatically takes care of this for you, and it assigns numeric labels to each image. So great, that's very convenient. And as an exercise, you can try to implement the image folder class yourself, or you can go to GitHub and check the source code of the image folder class. And it's a good exercise always to understand how these classes work, because ultimately libraries are nothing but collections of helper functions and classes, which you can often write yourself in not more than 50, 60 or 100 lines of code. Okay, and often these classes are really small. So do check it out if you have the time. Regardless, we have a good intuitive understanding of what the image folder class does and how to use it. Now we have an image, and that we can view it using matplotlib, but there's just one detail here we have to keep in mind. So we're defining a function show example, which takes an image, the image tensor, and it takes a label. And then what we're doing is first we are printing out the label, and the label is simply, the textual label is simply that label index passed into dataset.classes. That's going to give us the textual label. And then we are also going to print out the numeric label. So just for clarity, both the textual and numeric label will be printed. And then the one detail to keep in mind here is that the image, which has the shape 3 by 32, as you can see here, 3 channels, 32 pixels by 32 pixels. The only trouble here is matplotlib expects channels to be the final dimension. And that is where we are using the permute function. So the permute function of a tensor, the permute method, is going to take the channels and then switch them around. So we are saying that the 0th channel should come at the last position. That means, sorry, the 0th dimension should come at the last position. The first dimension and second dimension should come first. So what that does is it takes a 3 by 32 tensor and converts that into a 32 by 32 by 3 tensor, and now it can be displayed by matplotlib. And you may have learned about the tensor operation permute while doing the first assignment. Okay, so the image doesn't seem to be showing up for some reason. Oh, because we've just defined the function right now. So let's actually look at a couple of images. We've defined the show example function. Now what we're doing, the show example function expects an image and a label. So it expects two things, the image and the label, and we know how to get the image and the label. We can get the image and the label from dataset 0, because dataset 0 returns a tuple. And then we would be calling show example, and we will be passing in the image and the label. Now Python has some very special syntax to avoid this repetition, where you're taking a bunch of values out of a tuple or a list and then passing it in the exact same order. So whenever you're doing something like this, you are getting the image and label out of dataset, and then you're passing it into the show example function. What you can simply do is you can just put the star character, the asterisk character, and pass in dataset 0, and that will automatically take the values, the elements out of the tuple dataset 0, and it will pass them as individual arguments to show example. So this is exactly the same as this. Okay, and you can learn about this by just searching for star args on Python. So just search for this term, star args Python, and you can learn more about the syntax. But for now, all you need to know is that this star dataset 0 simply represents image comma label being passed as individual arguments. So we call show example, and here is the first image, and that's supposed to be an airplane. And you can see here that it's really hard to tell even for the human eye that this is an airplane. And let's look at another one. And this is also an airplane. And now this makes it really difficult because these two images, if you ask me, are very different. There is almost nothing common that I can see between these images. And that is what makes working with image data so difficult. And that is what makes, if you had to really write some kind of a function, if you had to write some kind of code, what code would you write to say that an airplane can be of this type and it can also be of this type? And this is where deep learning really shines, and convolutional neural networks really make it possible to capture such relationships as well. Okay, so with that, we have now loaded our data, we have converted them into tensors, and we are able to look at it. We are able to look at the data, study the labels. So let's save and upload our notebook at this point, because Colab, that it will shut down after some time. It is a temporary execution platform. So we are going to use the Jovian library, and we are going to run jovian.commit and pass in the project name. And when we do that for the first time, we will be asked for an API key. So let me just grab the API key from my Jovian profile here, and I'm going to paste it here. You only need to do this once within the notebook. And there you go. Now you have the API key that is already captured. Now the notebook is sent to your Jovian profile, and you can continue working on it by clicking on this link and clicking the run button. You can also find it from your profile. So the next thing now is to create training and validation datasets. We know that while building real world machine learning models, it is quite common and it's a good practice to split the dataset into 3 parts. Now you have the training set, and this training set is used to train the model. That is, you pass these images through a model with some randomly initialized weights, and then you get the outputs of that model, and then you compare them with the actual labels or targets, and you compute a loss. So for classification problems, we use the cross entropy loss, and then we use that loss to calculate gradients of the loss with respect to the weights, and then we apply the gradient descent optimization algorithm, which can adjust the weights of the model slightly. And then we do that repeatedly many times to improve the model and decrease the loss. Now this is something we've covered in a lot of detail in the first 2 lessons. So I highly suggest that you check out the first 2 lessons if you want to revise these, or if you've not seen them yet. But one thing that we understand is that a model trained on a certain data will be used on data that it has not previously seen before. So that is the reason why we have a validation set. A validation set is used to evaluate the model while training and adjust the hyperparameters, things like learning rate, etc., and pick the best version of the model. So as we experiment with different hyperparameters, as we experiment with different batch sizes, learning rates, or even different structures of models, a validation set can be used to really report the actual accuracy or the actual result that we are going to expect to see in the real world. And sometimes this is a common question that comes up: why do we really need a validation set? So think of it like preparing for an exam. So you have a book, and then you have a bunch of questions on the book. Now, if you simply solve and memorize all the questions in the book, that doesn't mean that you have learned the concepts covered in a particular chapter. And that is why you have these regular exams. And in these exams, you are normally asked some questions that are similar based on the questions that you've already seen, but they are different. Maybe they have different inputs, they have different values, they have certain subtleties. And your performance in the exam is what really indicates how well you understood the material, and not how well you have memorized the answers in the textbook. Right? So that's what it is. The training set contains you can think of it like the questions in the textbook in the chapter. The validation set is like exams that you have during your semester. And then finally we have something called a test set. Now what we do for research purposes, all standard data sets typically have a test set, and that test set is kept completely separate and it is clearly defined. And this test set is used to compare different types of model or different types of modeling approaches, or even to compare the results given by different researchers. So as a researcher or as a machine learning practitioner, you would have to train a model using only the training and validation sets, and then just give your best model out. And the best model's accuracy and performance will be reported on the test set, so that everybody is reporting their numbers on the same data. Okay. Now in this case, we do have a test set as well of 10,000 images, and then 50,000 images are part of the training set, but there is no predefined validation set. So what we can do is we can set aside a small portion of 5,000 images of the training set to be used as the validation set. So we will use the random split helper method from PyTorch to do this. And one other thing we are going to do is we are going to call torch.manualSeed, and we are going to set the random seed to a fixed value. Now this value doesn't have to be 42, you can set it to anything that you want, but the idea here is when you do this, then this initializes the random number generator of PyTorch, and the moment you generate a validation set using random split, it will ensure that each time the same 5,000 elements are selected for the validation set. Now why are we doing this? Because you will be running this notebook multiple times, you will be restarting this notebook multiple times, and it will be a good idea for you to standardize your validation set. So just as there is a globally standardized test set, you can standardize a validation set that you can use to evaluate your models, so that you are not evaluating them on a different set of images each time. And to do that, the best way is to set a manual seed right before you create the validation set. So now we've set the random seed, we've set the manual seed to 42, and now we are going to create a validation set. So the validation set is going to have a size of 5,000 images, and the training set is going to have a size of 50,000 minus 5,000, that's 45,000. And we can create these splits using the random split function. We pass in the full data set and we pass in the two sizes. That gives us the training data set and the validation data set. Then we can check the lengths of the training and validation data set, and this is exactly how we expected. So now we are ready to move on and create data loaders. Now one other thing I want to mention here is that the Jovian library also provides a very simple way for you to record important information about the dataset. And this is something that you should always do as a good machine learning practitioner. Every time you're working with a dataset, you should note down where you got the dataset from, what kind of what is the validation size you have, what is the random seed used to generate this. And as you do multiple experiments, you can also experiment with different sizes of the validation set. You can also experiment with maybe different sizes of the actual data set itself. So any information about the data set that you want to keep track of, you can either put that into a spreadsheet, or you can note it down in a notebook, or you can just call jovian.log dataset and then pass in a bunch of arguments. So I'm going to pass in the arguments like dataset size and random seed, but these can have any values you want. And I'm going to use the dataset URL that was already defined above, and the validation size was also defined above, and the random seed was also defined above. So now this information is going to get logged, and we will see how it shows up on the Jovian notebook later. Now let's create data loaders for training and validation to load the data in batches. So here we are going to use a batch size of 128. One common question that comes up is how do you choose the batch size? And a good rule of thumb is to start with a batch size of something like 64 or 128 or whatever seems reasonable to you, and then keep doubling the batch size as you train. So you train the model once, and then you try doubling the batch size and see if try training the model again. And if you see that the training time decreases, then you can keep the higher batch size, and you can keep doubling the batch size till the training time keeps decreasing. Now at some point the training time will actually start increasing, and this is because the amount of data that you're putting onto your RAM or your GPU for each batch of gradient descent, that may be using up all the cores that are available, all the CPU or GPU cores, and so it may be taking longer to compute rather than using a smaller batch. Or another thing that could happen is that at some point you might start getting an out of memory error, which means your batches are no longer fitting on the GPU or CPU RAM. And once you get an out of memory error, that means you cannot use a larger batch size. So you should once again decrease the batch size to half or 1/4 and restart the notebook and run it again. Okay. So so the rule of thumb is then keep doubling the batch size till the training time decreases. So now we can create data loaders. So here we're creating a training data loader, train DS, and we're passing the batch size. We're setting shuffle to true because we want to shuffle the images before we create batches in each epoch. And this shuffling introduces more randomization, leads to faster training and more generalized models. Then we have the validation dataset as well. In this case, we are going to use a batch size or double the batch size for the validation data loader, because for validation, we are not going to compute gradients because we are not doing gradient descent. So we only need half the memory. So this is one thing that you can always do. For your validation data loader, you can double the batch size. Now, one other thing, we have these additional arguments, num workers and pin memory, and I will let you explore the documentation of data loader to figure out what these do. But what I can tell you is these ensure that loading a batch of data is easier, that when images are being loaded, then it uses all the cores of your CPU. So if you have multiple cores, then it can use as many cores as there are. And this is how you specify num workers. And another thing it does is for each batch, it can keep a block of memory allocated. So if you know that each batch, the images are going to be of the exact same size and the whole batch is going to take up the exact same amount of memory, so you can specify pin memory equals true. Okay. And check out the documentation to learn more about what these do. So now we have batches of data. We have data loaders that will give us batches of data. And at this point, it would be nice to look at an entire batch at once. And this is always a good thing. Try to look at your data as many times as possible in whatever scenarios you can. So look at your data when you have downloaded the data set, look at your data when you've created data loaders, look at your data after you've trained the model and see its performance. And the more you look at the data, the more insights you get about the problem. So we are going to define a function called show batch. And what show batch is going to do is it will take a batch out of the data loader that is provided to it. So you'll get a batch of images and a batch of labels. And then it's going to plot these images, but we'll plot them in a grid, and that is where we're using the make grid function from Torch Vision. So the make grid function will take a batch of images and convert it into a single image. And one other thing that we're doing is, remember PyTorch tensors have the channel dimension at the beginning. So each image is like 3 by 32. What permute does is it will move the channels to the last dimension, and then we can plot it using matplotlib. So this is just some code to plot it, and you can see what it's doing by looking at the documentation, but it's fairly simple. And we are using a for loop here, but we are not going to go through all the batches. In fact, right after the first batch, we are going to break out of the for loop. So let's look at a batch from the training data loader. Let's create this first. Now this may take some time depending on the size of your data set and the size of individual images, because there's a bunch of processing going on to stitch the images together. And here we have one batch of training data, and what's always a good exercise is to just go through this data and try to classify it yourself. That will give you an idea of how difficult the problem really is. And it does seem like it can be quite difficult. Like some of these, it's really hard to tell what is in the image. For instance, this one, this seems pretty tricky. And this one right here is pretty tricky too. Not sure about this one. And you can look at you can also try printing the labels, try adding some more code into show batch so that the labels are also displayed next to each image if possible. And that'll be an interesting exercise to learn more about matplotlib. But in general, try to create reusable functions like this. Now, once you have this function show batch, you can take this and use it with any image dataset. And that's what you should be doing. Each time you train a new machine learning model, you should be improving, you should be creating a repository of functions that you can reuse the next time. So that the next time when you need to look at a batch of data, you do not have to think about what are all the steps involved in creating a grid and then showing it using matplotlib. You can simply use the show batch function. And this is in fact really how all libraries are created, that somebody did not want to repeat the work that they did for a previous project. So they simply wrap it into a bunch of classes and a bunch of functions and a bunch of modules, and then they first use it personally for a few days, and once they have a good enough, large enough repository that saves them a lot of time, then they share it online, and then it saves everybody a lot of time. So always keep this in mind, try to create good functions, and that's going to make you a good machine learning practitioner, and it's going to save you a lot of time. So here we have it. We have the show batch function. We called it on a training data loader, and we have looked at a batch of data. Try looking at a batch of validation data as well. Make sure that you have a good variety within both the validation and the training dataset. Try looking at the test dataset as well and see if the test dataset is any different from the training dataset. Now with that, once again, let us commit our work to Jovian before we proceed further. So now the notebook has been uploaded, and we can check it out here on this link. You can see that we have the notebook here, and all the code and outputs are captured as well. If you remember, we also called the log dataset function, and the output of the log dataset function gets recorded here in the records. So we have the dataset URL, we have the random seed, and the validation size. All of these have been captured. So next time you want to check a particular version, and you can see all the versions here. So each time you want to see what was different about the dataset in a specific version, you can just come down, select a specific version, and check the records tab of it. Okay. We will also similarly log other information like hyperparameters and metrics as we go along. And once again, you do not have to do this using the Jovian library. You can do it in a spreadsheet. You can do it in a notebook. There are a bunch of other tools that will let you do this. But the important thing is that you keep all of this information organized. And the more organized you are, the faster you will identify the next best approach to try. And as you end up with 10-15 experiments, you will know what are the ideas that work and what are the ideas that don't work. And this is something that makes a big difference between somebody who's just training a model blindly versus somebody who understands what's going on and can identify what to improve. All right, so now we are ready to define the model. And before we do that, we are going to define a convolutional neural network. So before we do that, we need to understand what convolutions are and why do we even need them. Now in the previous tutorial, we defined a deep neural network with fully connected layers using nn.linear. Now there are a couple of problems that you can think about. What we do in nn.linear is we take the image and then we flatten it out into a vector. And then we multiply each pixel with a particular weight, and then we simply add up all the products, and that gives us one element in the output vector. And similarly with another set of weights and biases, we get another element in the output vector, and so on. So if we are taking an image with 784 pixels, 28 by 28 pixels, and we want to get 10 outputs out of each image, so we are going to use one set of weights to get the first output and one set of weights to get the second output, and so on. Okay. Now the difficulty with that is, one, this does not capture spatial relationships. So if you have a certain pattern that occurs on the top left of the image, for example, the wing of an airplane can appear on the top left of the image, and the wing of an airplane will also appear on the top right of the image. Because the top left pixels have different weights from the top right pixels, so there is no shared knowledge, right? So for each pixel or each set of pixels, we need a repetitive set of weights which capture the same relationships if your object can move around within the image. So this is called, and this property is called spatial invariance. In images, you can move the object around, and even though the pixels are different, that can still represent the same object. Now linear layers do not capture that. The second thing is that they do not capture local relationships. Now, if you think about an image of a dog, for instance, what you really want to look for is shapes of ears, shapes of mouths, shapes of the hair and things like that. And it is these small local patterns that really determine what an image is. Of course, the local patterns have to come together into a larger image together. That's also an important part, but the local patterns are really the key elements. And because what we do is we flatten out a vector, and then we simply apply one weight to each pixel, and then we add up everything. We are not really giving a lot of importance to pixels that are nearby, especially pixels that are one above the other. So when you flatten out an image like this, then this pixel and this pixel go very far away from each other. and there is no special relationship between these two pixels than between these two pixels, right? Each two pixels have exactly the same amount of relatedness to each other because we are just applying everything, a weight to everything and adding it up. Okay, so think about that. Think about all of these things, all of these very natural insights that we have about images, which we are not able to capture using a simple weights matrix. And that is where the convolution operation comes into picture. So in the convolution operation, we do not apply an individual different weight to each pixel. On the other hand, we use something called a kernel, and a kernel is, you can see this small 3x3 window that is moving around, sliding around the image. And you can see on the bottom right, the numbers are the same. So you have 0, 1, 2, 2, 2, 0 and 0, 1, 2. So these are the weights of the kernel. So what we do is we have a 3x3 matrix, and let's assume we're talking about a single channel image here. So we have a 3x3 matrix, and in that 3x3 matrix, we have some weights. So we have 9 weights, obviously. And we take that 3x3 matrix and then place it on the top left of the image. And then we multiply the weights of the matrix with the specific pixels of the image. So we multiply it with these 3 pixels, the first row of the weights matrix, the second row of the weights matrix gets multiplied with these 3 pixels. And then the third row of the weights matrix gets multiplied with these 3 pixels. So we place it on the top left, and then we take the products that we get, the element wise products, and then we add up all the products. So that will give us the number 12. And you can verify that when you place it on the top left and you take the products and add them up, you get the number 12 out of it. And then we slide that kernel. So the animation that you're seeing is of sliding the kernel. So we slide the kernel one step and then use this next patch. And from that, we get back the next output. And then we slide it to the next position, and then we get the next output, and then we slide it to the next row, and then we get the next output, and so on. So we take all the valid positions of the kernel, and for each valid position, we perform the element wise product and add up those results, and that gives us an output. What we get is we take the 2x2 image, and then we get back, we take a 2-dimensional image, which is a matrix basically, and then we get back a 2-dimensional output. So we are no longer converting it into a vector. So we are no longer losing spatial relationships. Another thing to keep in mind is that this output is actually capturing some information about these pixels. So you also maintain this connectedness that now this output captures the information about this patch, and then this output captures the information about this patch, and so on. Okay, so this is what one convolutional layer does. It takes this image and then it converts it into this image-like object. Now it is no longer an image, but it has the same shape as an image. Okay, and this is how it works for a single channel. So this is a one channel. This is assuming it's a grayscale image, and we'll talk about multiple channels. And again, a convolution is a really simple operation to apply here. In fact, I have defined this function called apply kernel, which can take an image. So you can see here the same image that was there above. We have replicated it here, 3, 3, 2, 1, 0, and so on. And it can take a kernel. So here we have the 3x3 kernel that will be first placed here at this position, and then at this position, and so on. And we are just running a bunch of for loops, and we are generating the output values. So I'll let you go through this function and figure it out. It does exactly what I've told you just now, which is it simply places the kernel at the top left, gets element wise products, adds them up and gets an output, and then slides the kernel to each valid position where the kernel can be placed. And that gives us the output. So you can see when we apply the kernel to the sample image, we get back the output 12, 12, 17, 10, 17, 19, and 9, 6, 14. So there you have it, 12, 12, 17, 10, 17, 19, and 9, 6, 14. And that's really all it is. So now our weights matrix is this kernel that will be applied onto the image, and it will give us a 2D output. And this is how it works for one channels. Now for multi-channel images, a different matrix is applied to each channel. So let's look at that. And for this, I will refer you to this excellent blog post by Irham Shafkat called Intuitively Understanding Convolutions for Deep Learning. So we already know this, that we have this kernel sliding over the image, and then that gives us this output. So that's great. Now there are a few things that are used to make these things work for multiple channels. So let's talk about that. We've seen this 2D convolution operation and how we get an output out of it. Now for multiple channels, what we do is this. we have, you can see the sliding matrix. So we have three matrices. Now the kernel consists of, if your image has three channels or the input to the convolution has three channels, then the kernel will also have three channels. So there is one matrix which will be sliding over the red matrix of the image and producing a red output matrix. And similarly, there will be one matrix within the kernel which will be sliding over the green matrix of the image and will be producing an output for the green matrix. And similarly, you will have a 3x3 kernel matrix that will be sliding over the blue channel, over the blue matrix of the image, and that will produce another output. So now for multi-channel images or for 3-channel images, you are going to get back 3 output. These are called feature maps. So you're going to get back 3 output feature maps. And then what we do is then we add them all up. So we do an element wise addition. So this element gets added to this element, and this gets added to this element. So now that gets reduced to a single matrix. Okay. And you can spend some time here, read through this blog post to understand what's happening. Just to repeat, what we're doing is if you have 3 channels on the image, then your kernel will also have 3 channels. Each matrix will have 9 different values, and then those matrix will be slided over the red, green and blue channels. And then you will get the 3 outputs, and the 3 outputs or the 3 feature maps, as we call them, they are all added together to create one matrix. Okay. So now that was one kernel. So one kernel takes the image and the 3-channel image, converts it into one matrix. Now, if you have multiple kernels, now the multiple kernels, what we are going to do for multiple kernels is that you have this one kernel which has 3 channels. Similarly, you can have another kernel which has 3 channels and has another set of weights. Similarly, you have another kernel which has 3 channels and another set of weights. And if you apply each of these kernels independently to the image, so you will get back from each of these kernels a final output map, and the output matrix of each of these kernels is treated as one channel in the output map. Okay. So this can be sometimes a little bit tricky to wrap your head around, that we are taking the 3 channels and then we are running we're running one kernel over it, and then we get 3 outputs, and then we add them together to get one matrix that is one channel of the output. Then we take another kernel altogether which has another 3 matrices, run them through the run them over the input images, get another output, another 3 outputs, add them together, and that forms another output channel. And then we keep repeating that process. And why do we do this? What we do here is we take this 3-channel images and then we can change the number of channels to whatever we want. Depending on the number of kernels we apply, we can get one output channel for each kernel. So we can take a 3-channel image and convert it into 10 channels, 16 channels, 32 channels, and so on. And this is a very useful technique, as we will see slowly. All right. So that is how you go from single channel kernels to multi-channel kernels. Now you can go through this blog post. This is a great post and you should spend at least a couple of hours studying it. Convolution is a fairly intuitive thing, but it takes a while to wrap your head around exactly what is happening. Do sit with pen and paper and try to work it out. And if you work it out once using pen and paper, that will make things very clear for you. And if you want, you can also explore it using code. So there is a blog post called Convolutions in Depth by Sylvain Gagger. And this explains the exact same thing that the blog post explains this time, except it is done using code. So whichever makes more sense to you, whether it is code or it is blog post, you can, or it is visual, you can follow that. And that's the convolution operation. Now there are a couple of things that I want to cover, which are additionally used within convolutions just to get slightly better results. So now one thing you might be noticing here is that this particular 5x5 image got reduced to a 3x3 output. And especially this, while the kernel is running over the internal values multiple times, the values in the corners are covered only once. And this is where what we do is we introduce something called padding. So what we do is we take the input image and then we add blank pixels. So we simply add pixels with the value 0 for the red, green and blue, whatever channels there are, we just put the value 0 around it. So we add 1 pixel of padding around the image, and then we slide the kernel over that larger image with the padding. And what that does is that returns an output of the same size as the input. Okay, so that is called padding, and here we have used a padding of 1 pixel, but you can also have a padding of more than 1 pixels. If you have a padding of 2 pixels, for example, the output is actually going to be larger than the input. And normally what we want is we want to keep the output matrix size the same as the input matrix size. So we use a padding of 1. Now that's one thing. Another thing is stride. Now we have been so far moving the kernel by 1 position each time. But if you want, you can actually move the kernel by 2 positions too. So here you can see that the kernel goes directly from this top left. It skips this pixel and then goes directly to this pixel. And sometimes people use stride 2 convolutions or stride 3 convolutions and so on. But most of the time you will see a stride 1 convolution where you're sliding the kernel pixel by pixel. So that's all you need to know about convolutions. You need to understand what kernels are. So kernel is simply a weights matrix, which is a 2-dimensional weights matrix, or sometimes a 3-dimensional if you have multiple channels. So it is the weights matrix. So the weights matrix are applied to the images by sliding that kernel. So now instead of having 1 weight per pixel, you have a fixed number of weights, which is the size of the kernel. So if the kernel is a 3x3 kernel, you have 9 weights, and then across 3 channels, you have 27 weights. So that's a small number of weights. And each of these kernels can learn a particular pattern, which it can identify on any position within the image, right? As you have multiple kernels, they learn to identify multiple patterns. And these are really the advantages offered by convolutional layers when working with image data. The first thing is there are fewer parameters. You have a small set of parameters, the kernel, which is used to calculate the output for the entire image. And each kernel, as we just learned, can have 9 or 27 weights. That's it. And then you can have multiple kernels, each of which slide across the image. So multiple kernels can learn multiple features. For instance, there could be one kernel which learns how to identify the ear of a dog. And now that kernel can identify the ear of a dog in any position within an image. And then there could be one kernel which identifies the hair of a dog or the teeth of a dog. And one kernel which identifies the wing of a plane. And this kernel can identify the wing at any place. And that is called parameter sharing and spatial invariance. The features learned by a kernel in one part of the image can be used to detect a similar pattern in a different part of the image as well. Finally, another thing is what is called the sparsity of connections. In each layer, each output element only depends on a small number of input elements. And what that does is that makes the forward and backward passes more efficient, because not every output is connected to every pixel, which is what happens in the case of linear layers. So that takes a lot more computation as well. Here, each output is only connected to 9 pixels from the input. And that makes the computation a lot easier. That makes the backward pass, the gradient computation, all of it, the gradient descent algorithm, all of it much faster. And what that allows us to do is that allows us to create much bigger models or have many kernels, hundreds or thousands of kernels and multiple layers, 10 layers, 100 layers. Sometimes people have even trained neural networks with 1,000 layers, and that can still be trained within a reasonable time on a GPU. Okay. So that was the convolution, and there is just one other thing that we need to know. Apart from convolution, we also use a layer called max pooling. And what max pooling does is its purpose is to progressively decrease the height and width of the output tensors for each convolutional layer. What we do is, suppose we have a 4x4 output and we are just looking at one channel of the output here, and you may have multiple channels. We take every 4 pixels and then we replace it simply by the maximum of these pixels. Okay. So that's all it is, max pooling. And what we do is, as in a convolutional neural network, the general strategy that we will apply is that we will increase the number of channels. By using multiple kernels, we will increase the number of channels. So we will take a 3-channel image, pass it through a convolutional layer and maybe get 16 channels or 32 channels. And we will decrease the height and width of the output. So instead of it being a 32 by 32 pixel output, it will become a 16 by 16 pixel by applying a 2x2 max pool. Now you can also have 3x3 max pool and so on, but normally we do not use them. We use 2x2 max pooling. Okay. So that's a lot to take in, and spend your time with it. Pause the video, think about it, get a pen and paper, read through the blog post, see the animations, see the code, do whatever you need to get a clear understanding of convolutions. And one last thing I want to say is, although it seems like this may not be a linear operation, or this may not be a matrix multiplication, but it is actually it can be proved that a convolution can be represented using a matrix operation, using basically a linear operation of some kind. So in some sense, we are still applying some kind of a matrix multiplication. It's just that it's not in the way that you might normally see a matrix multiplication, right? But there are ways to express convolutions as matrices. Now, before we define our entire model, let's see how a single convolutional layer followed by a max pooling layer operates on data. And you can even do it, we can even do it step by step before we apply both. Let's say, let's create a conv layer, and we create a conv layer using nn.conv2d. So here we have nn.conv2d, and here we take, we specify what is the number of input channels. So now the input will have 3 channels, red, green, and blue. And then we specify the number of kernels, right? So and the number of kernels also decides the number of output channels. So now the number of kernels, we are specifying 8. So we're going to take a 3-channel image and convert it into a 8-channel output. And now we can no longer call that an image, because that is going to have 8 channels, and we do not know how to visualize or interpret 8 channels, but they represent something. And this output is typically called a feature map. Then we are going to use a kernel size of 3, and then we are going to use a stride of 1, and then we are going to use a padding of 1. Now, kernel size of 3 simply means that the kernel is a 3x3 kernel. The stride simply means that we are going to slide it across each pixel. We are not going to jump any pixels. And then the padding means that we are going to have 1 pixel of padding around the input before it is passed, before the kernel is applied, so that the output has the exact same dimensions as the input. Okay, so that's our convolutional layer. So let's run it. And we have this batch of images from our previous for loop. So we can just check images.shape. All right, let's grab a batch of images here. Yeah, here we have a batch of images, and we can just check images.shape. You can see that the batch of images has the shape 128 by 3 by 32. Let's pass it through the convolution layer. So let's pass the images through the convolutional layer, and let us then print the output shape. So you can see that we have gone from 3-channel images to an 8-channel feature map. And because we have used a kernel of size 3 and a stride of 1 and a padding of 1, there is no change in the dimensions. So each of these 32 pixels, we take 3x3 sections of these 32 pixels, and each of them is used to calculate 1 pixel within the output. Okay, so the output feature map has the shape 128 by 8 by 32. Next, let's introduce a max pooling layer. So here let's define another layer called pool, and this is simply going to be nn.maxpool2d. And max pooling, we have to specify what is the size. We take 2 pixels horizontally and 2 pixels vertically and pool them. So let's take the output and let's put the output through the pool layer. So we're taking the output here that we got, and we pass it through the pool layer, and then we want to print it out. And as you might expect, what this will do is this will take every 4 pixels and replace it with a single pixel. So now you see here, now you end up with, going from a 32 by 32, you now end up with a 16 by 16. And if you understand this, then you've basically understood what convolutions are and how convolutions work. So the convolutional layer is used to increase the channels. Each kernel is going to learn some specific feature of the image. And then the max pooling layer is used to decrease the height and width of the feature map. Okay, and we will then just keep doing this progressively. Now you know what to do, because both of these are linear operations. After a linear operation, we apply a non-linearity, and then we apply another linear operation. So we are simply going to stack these combinations over and over, and that is going to be our convolutional neural network. And remember, the weights are the values inside the kernels, and initially the weights are initialized randomly. So we have randomly initialized kernels inside this convolutional layer. In fact, you can check the values of the kernels as well. If we check conv.weight.shape, you can see it has 8 kernels. Since we've specified that we want 8 output channels, there are 8 kernels, and each of these 8 kernels contains 3 matrices, because the input channels there are 3 input channels. So each of these kernels contains 3 matrices, and inside each of these inside each matrix you have a 3x3 matrix that is going to be sliding over the image. In fact, we can go in and let's just check one matrix out of one particular kernel. Yeah, let's remove that. Let's see. Yeah. Let's see one matrix. So this is one matrix inside of the first kernel. So the kernel with index 0. If you want to see all three matrices inside the first kernel, so this is our first kernel. This is the matrix for red. This is the matrix that will be used for green. This is the matrix that will be used for blue, and that will produce one output channel. If you want to see all the output channels together, you can see that this is the matrix for this is the kernel for the first output channel. This is the kernel for the second output channel, and so on. All right. And that's your convolutional layer. And the max pool layer does not have any weights, does not have any biases. So the max pool layer really is not really something with parameters. It just applies a very simple rule, which is to pick the maximum value. Now, since this is such a common thing to take the input of one layer and pass it into another, there is a special class called nn.sequential that you can use to create models. So instead of having to extend the nn.module class and define the init function and define the forward function, which is often prone to errors as well, what you can do is you can simply use nn.sequential and give it a list of layers that you want in your model. For example, if we want a max pooling layer, we want a convolutional layer followed by a max pooling layer, all we need to do is create nn.sequential with these two layers. And now when we pass in a batch of images into the simple model, it's going to first pass it through the first layer, and then it is going to take the output of the first layer and pass it through the second layer, and it's going to take the output of the second layer and pass it through the third layer, and so on. Okay, so nn.sequential is a really useful, handy tool so that you don't have to write as much code as we have done in the previous lessons. So let's define this model once again, simple model, and you can see that it takes this batch of 128 images, 3 by 32 pixels, and then it converts it into a batch of 128 outputs. The output feature maps have 8 channels and 16 by 16. And this is all what we do in our convolutional neural network. We progressively increase the number of channels, and we progressively decrease the height and width of the image or the output feature map. Okay, so now we are ready to define our model, and we will define our model in two parts, because as we are starting to see by now, image classification is a very common problem where the loss that we use is cross entropy loss, and then the metric that we use for evaluation is the accuracy metric. So to avoid writing a code over and over for different datasets, we can extend the nn.module class and capture all of the image classification related code in a single base class called image classification base. So this is we are extending the nn.module class and we are calling it image classification base. And what we will do in the future is that any computer vision, any image classification problem that you're working on, you can simply use the image classification base class as a starting point. And we'll see that how we'll use it for CFAR 10. So in the image classification base, we are going to define some of the common functions that we have been defining till now. So we have a training step function. The training step function takes a batch, which from the batch we can get back images and we can get back labels. It passes the images into the model. So remember that self represents the object that will eventually get created, and the model object can be used as a function. So we can pass the images into the model to get back an output. And notice that we have not yet defined the forward function. And this is the interesting thing, that you can define these methods which use the forward function, but we will be defining the forward function in another class which will extend this class. And that's the interesting thing that sometimes can be a little tricky, that we are using functions that we have not defined in these common functions. But the idea is that you will never be instantiating image classification base directly. In fact, what we will do, as we will see soon, is we will extend the image classification base class for a CFAR 10 model, and then we will define the forward function. So whenever the training step function is called, it will have a forward function. Okay. If that doesn't make sense, just stick along for a few minutes and you will see what that means. Anyway, so we have the training step where we take a batch of images, pass it through the model, get an output, and then calculate the loss using cross entropy and return it. Similarly, we have the validation step. This is going to take a batch of data, a batch of inputs, images and labels. It is going to pass the images through the model, get the output. This is a batch of validation data, and then once again calculate the cross entropy, and it is going to calculate the accuracy. and then it's going to return the validation loss and the validation accuracy in a dictionary. And finally, we have something called the validation epoch end. So the validation epoch end is going to take the losses and accuracies from all the different batches of the validation data and simply combine them by taking a mean, and then it is going to return a single validation loss for the entire validation set, a single validation accuracy for the entire validation set. So that's your validation epoch end function. All of these will be used within our gradient descent fit function later on. And we have talked about these in a lot more detail in the previous two lessons. So do check out lesson 2 and lesson 3 to learn more about these. And finally, we have the epoch end function. The epoch end function will simply take the results of the epoch and the epoch number, and it will print them out. Okay. And then we also have this accuracy function, which is simply used to calculate the accuracy of the predictions. So if your model is taking a batch of 128 images as input and then giving out 128 outputs, we calculate the predictions of the model, the labels predicted by the model, by simply picking from each output vector the index which has the highest value or the highest probability. So we get, for each image, we get back a label, and then we compare those labels with the actual target labels, and that gives us an accuracy. Once again, this is discussed in a lot of detail in the logistic regression lesson, which is lesson 2. So do check out lesson 2 to learn about accuracy and how to interpret the predictions and so on. Okay. So that's our image classification base class, and going forward you can use this image classification base class for any of your machine learning model training. And in some sense you can forget about what's happening inside the class. All you need to know is that you extend this class, and then you define your problem specific model, you define your dataset specific model, and then you can use that for training. Okay. So now here we are finally extending the image classification base class to create the CFAR10 CNN model. So now this is a model, a specific network structure that we are going to use specifically for the CFAR10 dataset. So this is something where we only need to have the model, only need to have the dataset specific and model specific code. So what we are going to do is we are going to define self.network using nn.sequential. And you know what nn.sequential does? It is simply going to pass the input through each of the layers, and it's going to take the output of the first layer and pass it through the second layer and so on. So let's see what we're doing here. So we take this nn.conv2d layer, this is the first layer, and we are saying that it is going to take a 3-channel image, a RGB 3-channel image, and give the output as 32 channels. And it'll have the kernel size of 3, and it'll have the padding of 1 and stride of 1. So that means the output will have the exact same dimensions as the input. And one important thing to note is that because convolutional layers involve kernels, and these kernels can be slided over the entire image, as such they can work with images of different sizes. So you do not need, there is no need to specify the actual size, the height or width of the image. All we need to know is how many channels the image has. So the image has 3 channels, and the 3 channels will get converted to 32 channels, and then the dimensions of the image will be retained in the feature map. Okay. So when we are at this point, before we pass the image into the first layer, so the input will be of each input, and we have a batch of inputs, but each input will be of the dimensions 3 by 32. Okay. And at this point, after passing through this convolutional layer, you can probably guess that 3 channels increase to 32 channels, and then we have 32 channels. So we have a 32 by 32 feature map. The height and width remain the same. Then what we do is we apply ReLU. So this is very interesting. We can actually use the nn.ReLU layer, and it's not really a layer because there are no parameters inside it, but it's a neat thing that PyTorch offers, that you can create this nn.ReLU layer. And all this layer does is it applies the activation function. It does not have weights, does not have biases. All it does is it takes the output feature map that we get, and for each pixel, for each value inside the output tensor, which is the 32 by 32 tensor, it is going to look at each value, and if a value is negative, it is going to replace it with 0. If a value is positive, it is going to retain it, right? So that is your activation function. This is what introduces the non-linearity within the model. and since it does not affect the input tensor shape, the output is still going to be 32 by 32. Next, we have another convolutional layer. So this is a common pattern you will see, 2 convolutional layers and then a ReLU between them. So we have another convolutional layer which takes the 32 channels and it applies 64 kernels to create an output of size 64 by 64. So now, an output with 64 channels. So once again, the dimensions, the height and width of the feature map remain the same, but the number of kernels increase from the number of channels increase from 32 to 64 when you get the output for a particular image. Then once again, we apply ReLU here. And now you can see that the ReLU is going to retain the structure. Then we apply a max pooling layer. So now we apply a 2 by 2 max pooling layer, and you can guess what it does. It's going to take each set of 4 pixels and it's going to simply replace them with the maximum value. So a 32 by 32 output map is going to get replaced by a 16 by 16 output map, and we will still have the 64 channels. So the result of this entire block is that we've started with 3 channels and 32 by 32 height and width, and we've increased that to 64 channels, but we've reduced the height and width to 16 by 16. And what we have also done is we have used all of these kernels. So there are these layers in each layer. In the first layer, there are 32 kernels. Then there is a non-linearity. Then there are 64 kernels. Then there is a non-linearity. And what each kernel does is each kernel learns some specific feature about the input image, and progressively then the kernels of the second layer learn some features about the output feature map of the first layer, and so on. So as we keep stacking these kernels with non-linearities, they keep progressively learning stronger and richer relationships, and that is how a convolutional neural network works. Now that is the first block or the first chain of layers, and then similarly we have a few more layers. This time we are going from 64 to 128 output channels, and then we are going from 128 to 128 output channels. So even though we are not increasing the number of output channels here, just the fact that we have another layer and we have another non-linearity means that there are more parameters which can be trained within the model. And then once again we do a max pooling. So now we end up with 128 channels and then a 8 by 8 feature map. Then we have this again where we go from 128 to 256. So next we end up with 256 channels and a 4 by 4 feature map. And you can keep going like this. You can keep going for as long as you want. You can add more convolutional layers here. You can add more max pooling layers. And that is why we call this deep learning, and that is why we call this a deep neural network, because now it's getting pretty deep. We have 1 convolutional layer, 2 convolutional layer, and I'm ignoring ReLU because they do not really have any parameters. So it's not really a layer, even though we are writing it as a layer for convenience so that we can use nn.sequential here. And I'm also ignoring max pool because again, it's not really a layer. It does not have any parameters, but you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. You have 6 convolutional layers. And then we take the final output, which is 256 by 4, and we pass it through something called nn.flatten. Once again, this is not really a layer in the sense that it does not have weights and biases, but what it is going to do is it's going to take this output feature map and then flatten it out into a vector. And why are we flattening it out? Because at the end, what we want is we want a vector of size 10, because there are 10 classes. So we want for each image, we want to get back 10 outputs, each output representing the probability that the image belongs to a particular class. So ultimately at some point we will have to flatten, but we have captured a lot of relationships already, because each of these kernels is going to capture the relationships between relationships between related pixels within the data. So we have captured a lot of relationships already, and after 6 convolutional layers we can do this flattening. So we call nn.flatten. So now this becomes a vector. This, instead of being a tensor, it becomes a vector by 256 times 4. So this actual number is what determines the size of the vector now, and now we can pass it into a linear layer. So now we pass it into a linear layer, and then we get 1024 outputs. Then we apply ReLU, and then we take those 1024 outputs, convert them into 512 outputs. We apply ReLU again, and then we take those 512 outputs and convert them into 10 outputs. Okay, so we have 6 convolutional layers and 3 linear layers. Now that's a 9-layer neural network. Pretty good. And that is our CIFAR10 CNN model. So we take the CIFAR10 CNN model and then we can instantiate it simply by invoking this class. And now if you're working with a different data set, all you have to change is instead of a SFAT and CNN model, let's say if you're working with a data set like ImageNet, so you create an ImageNet CNN model and then you can change the structure around a little bit. You can, based on the number of classes, you can change this number, you can add more convolutional layers and you can experiment with it. Okay, so feel free to experiment with the actual model and you always have the common functionality captured within the image classification base class. Now, this is our model, and if you try to simply display the model, you can see that the nn.sequential shows all the layers in order for you. Now let's verify that the model produces the expected output on a batch of training data. So we are going to take a batch of images from the training data loader and we are going to check the shape. Then we're going to pass the images into the model and we're going to get back an output, and we're going to check the shape, and then we're also going to look at the output for the first image. So you see here you have a batch of 128 inputs, 128 images, 3 by 32 images. They pass through the convolutional layers, the max pooling layers, the ReLU, then the flatten layer, then the linear layers, and ultimately we end up with a batch of output vectors, each of size 10. Conceptually, if you think about it, we've not done anything too different from what we were doing 2 lessons ago, where we had this model, this some function or some black box, which was taking images, multi-channel images, and then reducing it into a single vector of size 10. And then we knew how to interpret these 10. Each of these 10 was going to be interpreted using softmax as a probability for each of the 10 classes that we have. For example, this would represent probability for airplane. This would represent probability for the next class, which was, I think, automobile. This would represent probability for cat. Of course, you have some negative values here, so we apply the softmax function to convert these into probabilities. And then what we say is that the prediction of the model for the first image is simply the value with the highest probability. For instance, in this case, I think 0.04 is the highest output. So that means the model's prediction for this particular image is 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 is the index 5. And you can look up dataset.classes to see what that index represents. Okay. So once again, this is covered in a lot of detail, how to interpret the output, how to get the predictions of the model. This is covered in the second lesson and in the third lesson, so you can go back and revise that. But the important thing here is that now we have a much more complex model, a multi-layer model, which has convolutions and pooling, etc., which performs the exact same function that our single linear layer was performing back 2 or 3 lessons ago. So when it comes to training the model, when it comes to applying gradient descent, we can apply the exact same process that we've applied so far. Now, before we train the model to seamlessly use a GPU, we have defined a few helper functions. Once again, we've covered this in a lot of depth in previous tutorials. So if you really want to understand what's going on here, how does the GPU help, you can go back. So we have a function getDefaultDevice. What this is going to do is it will check using torch.cuda.is available whether a GPU is available, and you can just check this here. If a GPU is available, if you have enabled a GPU, then you should be getting true for this. And if you get the value false, then one of 3 things could be happening. One could be that you do not have a GPU in your machine. So if you're running it locally, just check your hardware configuration on whether you have a GPU, or on Colab, you need to enable the GPU runtime. So make sure that you've enabled the GPU runtime on Colab or on Kaggle. Then if you have the GPU and it is enabled, the next problem could be that the NVIDIA CUDA drivers are not installed. So on your machine, you will need to go and install the NVIDIA CUDA CUDA drivers. So you can search for them. The instructions are also given here at the top. So make sure the NVIDIA CUDA drivers are installed. And then if you have the NVIDIA CUDA drivers installed, but you're still getting false here, then that means you may not have the right version of PyTorch. So PyTorch has different distributions, different releases for GPU and non-GPU. So make sure you install the GPU compatible version, and you can use a virtual environment to make sure that it does not affect your global installation. So create a Conda environment, and inside the Conda environment, install the GPU compatible version. So if you have the GPU actual hardware within your machine or connected to your cloud environment, and you have the NVIDIA drivers, and you have the right version of PyTorch, then you should see true here. Fortunately, all of this is already taken care of in Colab for us, since we have chosen a runtime. So if what we're doing is we want to write our code in a way that it can work even if there is no GPU. And that is why we have this get default device method. It checks that if the GPU is available, it returns a pointer to the device CUDA, which is basically the GPU. Otherwise, it returns a pointer to the device CPU. Then we have this function toDevice. It can take some data, some tensors or a list of tensors or a model, basically anything that can be moved, that needs to be moved to the GPU, and it will move that data or model or tensor to the GPU. So we will use this toDevice function. We'll give it some data or a model, and we'll give it the target device, and it will move it to the target device. And finally, we have this device data loader. This is a data loader class that is going to wrap our existing data loaders. And all it is going to do is when it yields batches of data for gradient descent, it is going to put those batches of data onto the device. So whenever a batch of images is loaded, it's going to put the batch of images onto the GPU. Okay. So first of all, let's get the default device, and if everything goes right, you should be able to get device type CUDA. Now, sometimes you will find that there are multiple GPUs attached to your machine, and there you might see things like CUDA 0. But as long as you see CUDA in the output, that means you have this device is now pointing to a GPU. Now we can do a few things. We can use device data loader and put in train DL and pass the device, and this is going to return a new object which is going to move our batches of data to the data loader while loading the batch, to the GPU while loading the batch. And you can see we are using the toDevice function here and passing in self.device. So the device data loader and can be used to wrap the training data loader and the validation data loader. And finally, we are using the toDevice function directly to move the model to our target device. And this target device could be a CPU or a GPU depending on what we get as the default device. And that makes our code generic enough so that it can run both with a CPU and with a GPU. And once again, let's just commit and save our notebook. We've done a lot of work so far. So before Colab shuts down, which can happen if you leave it idle for some time, keep saving your work from time to time using jovian.commit. So now we are ready to train the model. And to train the model, we are going to need two functions. We are going to need a function fit, and we are going to need the function evaluate. The function fit is going to perform gradient descent. So given the number of epochs, let's see here, given a number of epochs, it's going to loop over the number of epochs. And then in each epoch, there is going to be a training phase and there is going to be a validation phase. Now in the training phase, we do a few things. We get batches of data from the training data loader. So the training data loader is an input here. We get batches of data from the training data loader, and then we pass, we call the training step function. And remember, the training step function was defined in the image classification base class. And what it does is it takes a batch of data from the training set, which is passed here, and it returns the loss for that batch. Then we call backward on that loss, and then we perform gradient descent using an optimizer. So the optimizer is defined using an optimization function, and by default we use the optimization function torch.optim.sgd or stochastic gradient descent. But there are other optimizers that you can use, and the optimizer basically takes the model parameters, which is the weights and biases of all the layers. Now we have 9 layers with weights and biases, so it takes the weights and biases of all the layers. It takes the learning rate, and then it slightly updates the weights and biases using the gradients that have been calculated when we called loss.backward, so that the new weights and biases, the adjusted weights and biases, give a lower loss. Okay, and then for a full explanation of gradient descent, you can go back to lesson 1 and then also lesson 2, and you can revise that. But that is the basic idea here. It's going to apply gradient descent, and then it's going to clear out the gradients that were calculated using loss.backward. So that's our gradient descent step, and that is applied batch after batch for each batch. Now, one other thing you will see here is that we are actually keeping track of the training losses. So we want to keep the batch-wise training losses so that we can report the overall training loss for the epoch at the end. And we'll just see why that is useful. What we want to do is we want to report the training loss and the validation loss both at the end of the epoch. So that's one thing. Another thing to keep in mind is that we have this model.train. So now we are starting to introduce a lot of new layers. Apart from just convolutional layers and linear layers, we have things like max pooling, we have things like the ReLU layer, activation layers, and soon we will introduce some layers which have some additional parameters. And these layers behave differently when they are being trained, when the model is being trained and when the model is being evaluated. So to configure this behavior, we need to inform PyTorch when we are training and when we are evaluating. So in the training phase, we are simply calling model.train. And what that does is that tells PyTorch that we are now training the model. So these layers should be in training mode. And then at the end of the training phase, we call the evaluate function. The evaluate function is going to call model.eval. And this is going to tell PyTorch that these layers should be put into evaluation mode. And mostly what that means is that the layer should be frozen and there should be no randomization. And some of these layers use randomization in training, but we avoid randomization in evaluation. So one other thing we do within evaluate is we add this decorator torch.noGrad. What this tells PyTorch is that while the evaluate function is being executed, we do not want to compute any gradients because we are not performing gradient descent. All we want to do within the evaluate function is we want to get batches of data from the validation loader and pass it into the validation step function. So that will simply give us the validation loss and the validation accuracy for each batch. And then we are simply going to take the losses and accuracies and we're going to call validation epoch end, which is going to average out the validation loss and accuracy across the different batches of data and return a single output, which is the overall loss and accuracy for the validation set. Okay, so there's no gradients involved here. So that's why we are simply saying we do not need to track these computations for gradient descent. So that's what we get out of the result. We get back a validation loss and validation accuracy. And then we also have this training loss. So we are going to take the training losses that we have calculated batch wise, and we are simply going to calculate a mean and get the average training loss for the entire epoch. And finally, we are going to call model.epoch end, and that is going to print the epoch number, the training loss, validation loss, and validation accuracy. And one last thing that we do is we take the result and then put it into this history list, and we return the history list so that we have the entire training history of the model as the output of the fit function. Okay. And this is what we've been doing. We've been progressively enhancing our fit function to make it more and more powerful. And we have also made it very generic so that this fit function is the same irrespective of which kind of model you are using, which kind of data set you are using, which kind of loss function, which kind of metric you're using. All that gets captured in our model specific classes, things like image classification base and the CFAR10 CNN model. And this is what you should do. You should try to extract generic parts and have a set of generic functions that you can use with any problem. And as you work with multiple problems, try to see the common parts and extract those out. And the specific parts, try to create classes and try to create base classes and functions and basically some structures like these, some conventions like these, so that you can define later on for each problem that you solve, you can simply define the problem specific parts and use the generic functions that you've already created. Okay, so enough talk. Let's now kick off the training of the model. It's going to take a while, so I'm just going to run this and then we can talk about it. So first what we do is we are going to move this model to the device. So we are saying CFAR, we are once again instantiating the CFAR10 CNN model. So we're just getting a fresh copy of the model, and then we are moving it to the target device, which is the GPU using 2 device. And that's our final model. And then we're going to evaluate this model on the validation data loader. And we see that it gives us about 0.09 accuracy, which is about 10% accuracy. And this is what you might expect, because although we have set up convolutions and weights and max pooling and etc., remember that the kernels inside the convolutions are the weights of the model, and these kernels are initialized randomly. So these kernels are not performing any real activity right now. And that is why the result that you get out of the convolutional network is just a random result. And later on, what we'll do is as we train the model, the values inside the kernels will change. The weights inside the kernels will change, and each kernel in each layer will start to learn one specific feature of the input. Okay. So we are going to train for 10 epochs, and we're going to use the optimization function torch.optim.adam. Now Adam is a special optimizer. You can learn more about it. Just look for it online or look for the documentation within PyTorch. There is a paper, there is a great blog post explaining Adam. It uses a technique called momentum. It uses a technique called adaptive learning rates internally. So basically for each weight, it creates a special learning rate based on certain rules. But it does require an overall learning rate, which we are setting to 0.001. Okay, so we are using the Adam optimizer, and before we train the model, one thing that we should do is we should call log hyperparams. So we should simply note down somewhere what are the different hyperparameters we are using. So here we are using the number of epochs. The number of epochs will be 10. The optimization function, we can get the name of the optimization function using underscore name, and then we are also tracking the batch size and the learning rate. So you can use jovian.log hyperparams to log this information, just as we logged information about the dataset. And similarly, we will also log some information about the final metrics of the model. Or you can just write this into a spreadsheet or write this on a piece of paper, but make sure that every time you run an experiment, you log the hyperparameters. Now with that, here is the training, and I kicked off the training about 5 minutes ago. So we call the fit function with the number of epochs and the learning rate and the model and the training data loader, validation data loader, and the optimization function, which is Adam. And what this is going to do is this is going to just get batches of images from the data set, and it is going to pass them through the model. So the six convolutional layers and 3 linear layers. It's going to get the output, calculate gradients, perform gradient descent, change the weight slightly, that will reduce the loss, and repeat that for all the batches over an entire epoch. At the end of the epoch, it's going to evaluate the model on the validation data set. So you can see that after the first epoch, we get to a validation accuracy of 42%. And this is the training loss and this is the validation loss. And over time, the validation accuracy increases to about 75% or so. And in fact, it starts to go down again. And we'll talk about why that is. And the validation loss also decreases and starts to go up again. But the training loss continues to decrease. Okay. So that's the training. And all this is happening on 60,000 images, in each of which are 3-channel images, 32 by 32 pixels, hundreds of MBs. And all this we were able to do. And of course, the model itself is also quite large. So all this we were able to train in a very short time because we are using a GPU. Now you can try training it on a CPU and see how long it takes you. My bet would be it would take anywhere from tens of minutes to maybe an hour or two, depending on your processor. Now, just as we have recorded the hyperparameters, we can also record the final metrics. Remember, from the fit function, we get back a history, and the history is going to contain a list. Each list is going to be a dictionary. In fact, we can just see it here. So whatever is printed here, the exact same thing is available in a dictionary format inside the history for further processing. So we're simply going to take the history and get the last element out of it, and we're going to take the training loss, validation loss, and validation accuracy and log them as metrics to Jovian. Once again, you can write this down into a spreadsheet or a piece of paper, but Jovian gives you a way to keep this work organized as well. And now we can plot the validation set accuracies to study how the model improves over time. So we write this function plot accuracies that takes a history. It gets, for each epoch, it simply gets the validation accuracy out of it. And then this is some code to simply plot the accuracy. So let's see that. So you can see here that the accuracy of the model increases up to a certain point, around to about 75%. Then it starts to go up and down, and it actually starts to decrease. And you can try this out, try training for about 20 epochs, and you should see that the accuracy actually goes down fairly significantly after 20 epochs. But even then, our model reaches an accuracy of about 75%, and that's pretty good considering that this is a very difficult data set. And if you have done assignment 3, or whenever you do assignment 3, you will see you will be training a feed forward neural network on the same dataset CFAR10, and you will see that it is very difficult to cross the accuracy threshold of 60%, no matter how deep you make your neural network, or no matter how many weights you have in your hidden layers. And this is the real power of convolutions, because now these kernels can actually learn patterns which are local to specific parts of the image, and then they can detect those patterns in any part of the image. And because these kernels are sparse, because we have few weights, we can have a lot of kernels, and each kernel can learn a specific type of pattern. And these patterns progressively over multiple layers get combined together to determine which particular class an image belongs to. Okay, so all the benefits of convolutional neural networks come into play here to get us to the accuracy of about 75%. Now, to get an accuracy higher than 80%, we will actually need a more powerful model to capture the relationship between the images and the labels more accurately. And this you can do by adding more convolutional layers, increasing the number of channels in each convolutional layer, or by using certain regularization techniques. But let's do one other thing. Let's also plot the training and validation losses to study the trend, and we'll see something very interesting here. So this is what the graph looks like. The training loss starts out high and then keeps decreasing. And this is what you would expect, because we are training our model to reduce the loss. The whole purpose of gradient descent is to reduce the loss. So more or less the loss will keep going down. At some point, at a very low point, it might happen that the loss may bounce around a little bit, but as such, it's going to keep going down as long as you keep training the model with a reasonable learning rate. On the other hand, we can see that the validation loss decreases up to a point and then it actually starts to increase. So up till about 6 epochs, the validation loss decreased and then it started to increase. So what's going on here? And this is a very common trend that you will notice, that your training error or your training loss will reduce, but your test loss will, or your validation loss will start to increase after a certain point. So what's going on here is a phenomenon called overfitting. And overfitting is the number one problem why so many machine learning models give very terrible results on real world data. It's a common joke in machine learning circles that you say that my model has 95, 98, 99.9% accuracy, but then when you put it out into the real world, when you test it on some data that it has not already seen, it is performing really poorly. It's giving you just a 10% accuracy or 20% accuracy, and overfitting is the reason for that. So what's happening here is that since we are telling our model to minimize the loss, and our model has tens of thousands, sometimes millions of parameters, rather than learning patterns, general patterns about, let's say patterns about ears of dogs and patterns about teeth of dogs and things like that, rather than learning general patterns, the model starts to memorize specific training examples. Okay, so what this means is, just to once again go with the analogy of preparing for a test. Now, if you have a chapter in a book and there are a bunch of questions at the end of the chapter, and you simply memorize the answers to each of those questions without really understanding anything about the chapter, which is the general patterns. And every time you see, now in the exam, when you see a question, you simply try to paste the answers that you've memorized, right? So obviously those answers will be wrong. So that's the idea here, that by memorizing specific training examples, and that can be done because these models have hundreds of parameters and they can figure out all sorts of relationships. So rather than learning what makes a dog, it can learn that, okay, if I get a image which is exactly such, then it should be classified as a dog, and so on. So when your model memorizes the data, specific training examples, so the training error goes down, but your validation error goes up, because now it is no longer learning the general patterns. So if you simply memorize the answers, you're going to get a really bad result in your exam. So what you should be doing is you should be learning patterns, and there are several techniques that we can apply to make sure the model generalizes. And the techniques that we can apply are, one, to gather and generate, to gather more training data. So if you give more training data, obviously it becomes harder to memorize because the parameters are limited, and it is more beneficial for the model to actually learn patterns rather than generalized data. So more data is always a great solution for overfitting. But in cases where you do not have more data, where you cannot gather more data, then you can generate more training data. And the way to generate it is take images that you already have. Let's say you have an image of a dog, and then simply rotate it 10 degrees, or maybe shift it around a little bit, maybe zoom into it a little bit, or maybe apply a horizontal flip. All of these transformations are non-destructive and they will still point to an image of a dog. So now, instead of passing the exact same image of a dog into the model, what you can do is you can pass an image of a dog that is slightly different each time. What this will do is this will prevent the model from being able to memorize a specific picture or specific training example. You can also increase or decrease the brightness. You can change the color a little bit. And there are a lot of these techniques, and this technique is called data augmentation, that we are going to apply next time in the next tutorial. And you can also add noise to it. So you can randomly remove pixels here and there. Then there are certain techniques like batch normalization and dropout, which are also used to prevent memorization of specific training examples and hence prevent overfitting so that the model learns more general patterns. And there's another technique, because ultimately whatever you do, you will run into overfitting at some point or the other. So there's another technique called early stopping, where what you do is the moment you see that your validation loss has started to increase, you do not train your model further. That's one thing you can do. Another thing you can do is you can simply keep saving the weights of the model after each epoch and just retain the best weights. So you go through your entire training, but you only retain the weights of the model that has the lowest validation loss. And then you can simply load back that the best set of weights, and that's going to give you the weights which lead to the lowest validation loss, right? So this technique is called early stopping, where we train the model for a long time, but wherever we see that your model is starting to perform poorly, starting to overfit heavily on the training data, that is a point where we stop training. Okay. Now, one important thing that I want to tell you is it's not that your model is overfitting if the training loss is lower than the validation loss. In fact, whenever you train for long enough, your training loss will be lower than the validation loss. That by itself is not overfitting. Happens when your training loss is still decreasing, but your validation loss or test loss starts to increase. And that's a very important distinction. So keep training as long as your validation loss is decreasing. When it starts to increase, maybe still give it a few epochs, maybe still try it out a few more times and pick the point where the validation loss is the lowest for early stopping. So we'll cover all of these topics in a lot more detail in the next tutorial, and we'll learn how to reach an accuracy of over 90%. So right now we're at 75. We're going to get to about 94% accuracy, and we are going to do it in a much shorter time. We're going to do it in less than 5 minutes. So we're going to train a state-of-the-art model the next time. And before we do that, let's go ahead and let us commit once again. So now this time when we commit, now you might remember that we have actually recorded the hyperparameters and metrics. So if I go back here and I check the records tab now, you will be able to see the hyperparameters and the metrics of the model that we have logged so far. And in fact, if you go to the notebook tab and click compare, you can actually compare all the different models that you've trained and all the different results that you've obtained. So you can see here, these are all the different results that have been obtained by training the model. So moving right ahead, and I just want to once again mention that when you try different experiments, make sure that for each experiment, you note down what type of model you've used, what type of architecture, what are the epochs, what are the accuracy, loss, validation, so that when you have done 10 experiments or trained 10 different types of models, you can then analyze and pick the best model for your final reporting or for your final deployment. Next, let's test with individual images. So far, we've been tracking the overall accuracy of the model, but it's always a good idea to look at the model's results on some sample images. So we'll test out our model with some images from the predefined test dataset. So we take the test dataset and then we have the 2 tensor transform here, and we are using image folder once again. Then we have a helper function here, which is going to call which we're calling predict image. All it is going to do is it's going to take the image tensor and convert it into a batch of one image and move it to the right device. Then it's going to pass it into the model and get the predictions. And from the predictions, it is going to pick the index with the highest probability using torch.max. And then it is going to retrieve the class label for that index. Okay. So here we're trying it out with the first image. So this was an image of an airplane, and it's very hard to tell that this is an airplane, but yes, our model has predicted that this is an airplane. Let's try one more. So this one is an automobile and our model has predicted truck. You can see why, because trucks and automobiles can be quite confusing. So maybe it's a problem with the dataset, but maybe if you add more layers into the model, maybe it might be able to detect, because I think automobiles and trucks are about 90% same in terms of the features. You have wheels, you have this region where the person is sitting, you maybe have a steering, but where they might differ in specific areas, like on a car may be slightly lower, closer to the ground. A car may have a slightly more curved shape than a truck. And what you might simply need is just more kernels within your convolutional layers to identify more of these features, right? So the more kernels you add, the more features they can learn. Let's try one more. So this one is a frog, and I wouldn't be able to tell that this is a frog, but surprisingly the model was able to. And sometimes the background also plays in. So if a frog is normally going to get captured in a brown or a green background, so that also comes into play here. And so the model doesn't really know that this is the frog and that's the background, but the model can take everything into account and identify that this picture represents a frog. Now, identifying where our model performs poorly can help us improve the model by collecting more training data, increasing or decreasing the complexity of the model, and changing the hyperparameters. And what you should do maybe at this point is, since it's only 75% accurate, maybe run a for loop and get all the images that were classified incorrectly and see what the correct label was, what the incorrect label was, and look at the image, at least look at maybe 100 samples and try to identify what you might need to change. And sometimes it is the data set that needs to be changed. Sometimes it is the model that needs to be changed. Sometimes you just need to train for longer. Sometimes you need to add some regularization that the model is performing well on the training data, but it is not performing well on the validation data. And these are all insights that you will get by looking at the results. And finally, let's also get the overall result on the test data set. So we are putting the test data set, creating a data loader, putting it into the device using device data loader and calling evaluate. And within seconds, we get back the result, even though there are 10,000 images. And this is because we're using a GPU. And we get about 74.1% accuracy, which is close to the validation accuracy. So that's good that our final test accuracy that you can report in a blog post or a paper is about 74%. And that's close to the validation accuracy. One other thing that we have is we can save the weights of our model. So we can use torch.save and pass the model.stateDict to save the weights of the model to this file cfar10cnn.pth. And then we can we can instantiate the model once again. So we are creating model2 here and we are moving it to the device. And you can load the state dictionary like this. So you can say model2.load state dictionary. So now if you shut down the Colab notebook and you restart it, you do not need to train the model again, because you will have this file, this trained weights file, and you can load it into your model so that now the model will have the trained weights, and we can verify this by calling the evaluate function. So let's make one final commit using Jovian. And one other thing I'm going to show you here is how to include the model weights. So the model weights is, we have this, we can use a outputs parameter to jovian.commit, and here I'm going to pass in the file name cfar10cnn.pth, because what happens is when you shut down the Colab notebook, this file is going to go away, the trained model. So we want to attach the trained model weights along with our project, along with our Jupyter notebook, and that's exactly what happens. So now if we go to this, notebook, we can see on the files tab, you have an artifact, and this artifact is the cfar10cnn.pth model, and you can download it if you need to. So next time you start a new Colab notebook, you want to create the same model. So you can write the code for the model and instantiate the model, and then simply upload this file into Colab and load the weights from this file. Okay. So with each version of your model, you can record a particular weight, and you can check the records tab to check what this set of weights represents. For example, this set of weights has the test accuracy of 74% and test loss of 0.86. So we've covered a lot of ground in this tutorial, and here's a quick recap. We learned about the CFAR10 dataset for image classification. We learned about extracting and loading a dataset using Torch Vision. We saw how to view random batches of data in a grid using Torch Vision's main make grid function. We created a convolutional neural network using nn.conv2d and maxpool2d layers. We understood convolutions in a lot of depth, and we also looked at a visual explanation, which is where you should spend a little more time understanding and making sure that you have a clear picture of what convolutions do. If you wish, you can also check out the code and try to implement it yourself, or just work it out with pen and paper and a few examples. We captured information about the dataset, metrics, and hyperparameters using the Jovian library. Then we trained a convolutional neural network and visualized the losses and errors. We understood overfitting and the strategies for avoiding it, and we will do a lot more about this in the next lesson. We generated some predictions on single images from the test set, and then we finally saved the model's weights and loaded them and attached them to the experiment snapshot using jovian.commit. And there's a lot of scope to experiment, so I encourage you to use the interactive nature of Jupyter to play around. with the various parameters. So try changing the hyperparameters to achieve a higher accuracy within fewer epochs. Try adding more convolutional layers. Try increasing the number of channels. Try using a feed-forward neural network and see what is the difference between what happens when you add more convolutional layers versus what happens when you have more linear layers. And try to build some intuition there. Read about some strategies to reduce overfitting and try to implement them. Things like batch normalization and dropout is something you can try out. And then modify this notebook to train a model for a different data set. As I mentioned to you, if you go to this page fast.ai datasets, which is linked from the top of this notebook, you can pick any other URL here. Just right click and copy the link and you can paste that, and you will just have to make some changes to the model, or maybe not, it really depends. But just the size of each image is going to be different. Sometimes the image is not going to have 3 channels, it will have 1 channel. The number of categories can be different. The number of images per class may be different, but roughly about 95% of the code is going to be the same. And that is what makes deep learning so powerful, because it's a very generalizable technique. It can identify 10 different classes of objects. It can differentiate between 101 categories of foods. It can differentiate between different makes, different models on companies of cars. It can differentiate between different breeds of dogs. This exact same code, the exact same kind of model. And this is a really powerful thing, because before deep learning, there was no real way to do this, and you had to hand code a lot of logic to make this differentiation. But once deep learning was discovered and improved, and different kinds of models like convolutional neural networks were created, this has become a very simple problem to solve. And now you at this point understand all the details of it, right down to the very basics, the very basic matrix operations that are performed internally. So I hope you will experiment and take this notebook and experiment with a different data set. That is really the best way to learn this, really the best way to understand it, the best way to create something that best way to acquire the skills which will allow you to apply deep learning on real world projects. So please do experiment, please do try it out with a different data set. And that brings me to the course project, which is the next assignment that you will work on. Now for the course project, you will train a deep learning model from scratch, and you will work through it throughout the course towards the end. And what you're going to do is you will pick a dataset of your choice and apply the concepts learned in this course to train a deep learning model end to end with PyTorch, and you will experiment with different hyperparameters and metrics. So you will need to find a dataset online, either download something online or create one using web scraping, Google Images, and so on. You will then, it doesn't have to be images, you will then describe the modeling objective. So you'll identify what type of data it is. Is it images? Is it text? Is it audio? Is it tabular data? So you've also looked at tabular data. You can identify what type of problem it is, whether it's a regression problem, classification problem, or in the final lecture, we will see generative modeling using GANs. You can also use that. And you can clean the data if required and perform exploratory data analysis. You can plot some graphs, you can ask some questions. Then you will do the modeling. So you will define a model, a network architecture. You can reuse as much of the code as you need from the notebooks that we have so far. You will pick some hyperparameters, train the model, make predictions, evaluate on the test data set, save the model weights, record the metrics, and then try out different hyperparameters and regularization techniques to get the best results. And finally, you will summarize your learning, you will add explanations, you will identify opportunities for future work, and then you will publish and submit your Jupyter notebook. So this is a fairly significant project, and it is a very good reflection of what you will do in the real world. So try to pick a good real world data set. You can start with something from FastAI datasets, or you can also go to kaggle.com/datasets and pick a dataset here. Now what you will need to do though is you will need to download the data from here and then upload it to Google Colab. And we will also walk through the process of working through the course project with a small example. But in the meantime, today, right now, what you can do if you're done with the other assignments is that you can go through FastAI datasets, Kaggle datasets, and identify an interesting dataset which you want to build a deep learning project on. Now there is no starter notebook for the course project. You will be using the new notebook button on Jovian to create the course project, and you can give it a title, My Course Project or something like that, and create a public notebook. Then you can run it on Colab as we have been running so far. Now on Colab, you will run the notebook and then you can make some changes to it. You can download the data there. You can train a model, you can experiment different times. And finally, ultimately what you need to do is you need to run jovian.commit. So you need to run jovian.commit with the right project name. So I believe the project name here is my course project. Yeah, so you commit it with the right project name, and let's enter the API key here. Now the notebook gets uploaded, and then that is going to get uploaded to your profile, and then you can come here and you can make a submission. Now one other optional part of this is to write a blog post to describe your experiments and summarize your work. And you can use medium.com or GitHub pages to write your blog post, and inside your blog post you can embed cells from your Jupyter notebook. So we will go over this in more detail over the next 2 lectures as well. And you can submit your blog link as well, and we will be happy to feature it on our social media, on our Medium publication, on our newsletters. So we are looking for some interesting blog posts from you. And then you click submit, and that is going to make a submission for you. And you can also go and then share your course project on the forum. And you have some time for this, so take your time, plan it out. In total, I would say that after you're done with all the lectures and all the previous assignments, the course project should not take you more than 10 to 12 hours to get a basic version ready, and then the rest is up to you how good you want to make it. So you can spend another 10 hours, another 15, 20 hours. You can write a great blog post, and writing a great blog post is a skill in itself, but it is an important skill because presentation is an important part of data science and machine learning, because you need to present why your model is giving the kind of results it is giving, what are the techniques you've applied to get those results. It's a great way to just solidify your understanding and share your learnings with other people as well. Okay, so do review the lecture notebook. Then what you should do next, what we will cover next is lesson 5, RESTnets, regularization and data augmentation. So we will see some interesting techniques which this image here is representing. We'll understand what this means to improve the performance of our convolutional neural networks, and also make sure that it does not overfit easily. So it generalizes better to the validation data. Then finally, we will apply everything that we have learned into a completely new kind of problem, which is generative modeling, where instead of classifying images, we will learn from an image dataset and try to create new images of handwritten digits or of anime faces. So we look at 2 examples of generative adversarial networks. What you should do next is review the lecture video and run the Jupyter notebook on Google Colab, complete the course project, or at least get started with it, and then share your work and exchange feedback. You can work on the previous assignments as well, and you can participate in forum discussions and join a study group near you as well. I will see you in the forums. You can go to 0togans.com to access all the course materials and access the forum as well. The forum has been really active. There have been thousands of questions asked and answered. So I just want to give a big thank you to everybody who has been answering questions on the forum. And I just want to say that it's actually a great way to learn. Answering somebody else's questions is a great way to solidify your understanding, because that to explain something to somebody else, you first need to fill all the gaps in your own understanding, and you need to articulate it. And if you can articulate it something well, then that means you are likely to remember it better. You are likely to build on top of it more easily. So please go on the forum, not only if you have questions, but also to see what questions people are asking and try to answer those questions. You can follow us on Twitter on FreeCodeCamp, Jovian ML, and the next lesson, RESTnets, regularization and data augmentation. I'll see you next time. This is Deep Learning with PyTorch, 0 to GANs.